Thanks everybody for joining. This is the book that we're talking about. It's in reverse for you, so that'll be tricky for you to read, but let me read it for you. It's Locker Room Talk, and it's a guide to political correctness in the public domain. And I wrote this about 18 months ago now, just over 18 months ago. And what sparked it was I'm a big sitcom fan. I enjoy watching situation comedies, and probably my favorite is Seinfeld. I'm sure many of you have heard of Seinfeld. It's very smart, very clever writing. And there's wonderful character development over 9 seasons, I think it is. And I really enjoy watching it over and over again. I know it quite well. And sometimes, occasionally I watch it and they talk about, or they examine issues that might not fly today. Seinfeld was made in the 1990s, and that was a very different world to the one we live in today. And I think a lot of the time when they touch on these sensitive issues, they do it in a very clever way. It's satirical, and the definition of satire is to hold one's follies up to ridicule. So if anybody was racist or sexist or had any other kind of negative trait, what they would be doing is ridiculing that person, which is a good thing to do. Satire has been a very successful way of maneuvering through the arts over the years, and Seinfeld does it quite well. There's another situation comedy that was from my childhood that I know you've had in Singapore. Those of you who might be in your 40s and 50s might have heard of it, called Mind Your Language. That was set in the UK, and there were foreigners in England trying to learn English in an evening class. And there was an Indian, a Pakistani, a Spaniard, an Italian, there's a Swede, a German, a French woman, number of other different nationalities. And as you can imagine, this was a great comedic ground to compare cultures, compare nationalities, compare ethnicities. And the attempt was to try and make something funny out of the differences, I suppose. This was made in the 80s, I would think. And it really wouldn't run today. You don't see it on television these days. I have seen it quite recently, but you don't see it very much. And I don't think they'd show every single episode, because really it could offend a lot of people in the day in which we're living, in the 2020s. It's a very different world, and sensitivities are quite pertinent. So that's what prompted me to write the book. And I realized that there's a lot of education that's needed. People need to be aware of these sensitivities and the things that people can say that cause offense. And people also need to be aware that phrases change over time. If I think back to my father was, I think, a very good man, and certainly not a racist man. He was somebody who would try and integrate. Certainly he tried to integrate our family with the only Indian family that I was aware of where I lived. I lived on the Wirral, which is just across over the Mersey from Liverpool, those of you who know your geography in the UK. And in my town where I lived, and also the town where I went to school, I was only aware of one family that was Indian by ethnicity. And my father invited them to our home, and we got invited to their home, and it was nice. We were family friends. And I think that was all because my father was very keen to integrate us and to be welcoming to them. So I certainly don't see my father as a racist person, far from it. In fact, he would be the exact opposite. And so he tried, when he spoke about things that had that touched on ethnicity and race, to use the proper phraseology. And I remember that when he would refer to a black person, he would call that person coloured. And that, at the time, I was certainly very aware of this, was considered to be the correct way to refer to a black person. But these days, coloured doesn't really go down well, because it's too broad a phrase to describe really everybody who is non-white, non-Caucasian, I suppose. We can't afford to just lump everybody else into one group. And so you don't really hear the phrase coloured, not in the mainstream media, for example, anymore. Although you still do hear some people saying it, trying to be correct, trying to be polite and sensitive. But I think they've missed the boat somewhat, because these phrases and their acceptability, they do tend to sort of change over time. Why does it matter though? Why should we be more concerned to speak with sensitivity and to not offend people? I quote a comedian in the book who says that boy bands offend him, but nobody takes care not to talk about boy bands in front of him, and boy bands still exist. So where should we draw the line? Where should we become sensitive? Where should we sort of have heightened awareness that the things we're saying might cause offense? I think as we go through life, we observe things and we tend to learn from our observations, and that is how humanity has evolved. It's a very sound structure on which to develop. We learn that eating broccoli is good for us, but eating other kinds of vegetation might not be good for us. In fact, it might be poisonous. For example, some kinds of mushrooms, that sort of thing. We learn these things over time and we act upon what we've learned. We learn maybe not to go down a dimly lit street at 2 o'clock in the morning in some parts of the world, because we understand that there's probably a greater risk that we might get hurt or robbed or something. Well, we notice these things, we observe them, and we learn from our mistakes and the mistakes that other people have spoken to us about. So we observe and we form conclusions. The danger comes where we develop what's called a stereotype. And a stereotype, by definition, is an error. If you look in the dictionary, it clearly shows that to stereotype is an error. It's an oversimplification of what we're seeing. So we might associate a certain trait with a certain population. And we therefore think that everybody in that population has that trait. And that can be a problem. And clearly it's not an accurate thing to do. It's not a sensible thing to do. We notice the correlation, but it doesn't mean to say that everybody in that population has that trait. When we act upon those stereotypes, then we discriminate. And discrimination is bad because we deny people the right to a living. We deny them a job, perhaps. We deny them the opportunity to develop a relationship with us, maybe. All sorts of things we can deny people based on discrimination. I'll give you an example. Let's say we come out of a party. We've been round to somebody's house, we've had a lovely evening, eaten a lot of good food, perhaps had something to drink, had a good time. And we want to get home, we're tired, and there are, let's say, 4 or 5 or maybe 6 taxis in front of us, and they're all equidistant from where we're standing. How do we decide which taxi to get into? The drivers might be an array of different races, different ages, different genders, and we might, from our experience, from what we've learned over time, from our lives and from the lives of others around us, we might associate different ages and races and genders with certain characteristics that might dissuade us from getting into their cab. We might decide that some of those people who are of a certain age or certain race or a certain gender might very commonly be smokers, and we might not want to get into a cab that stinks of cigarettes. We might say that one of those characteristics, one of those populations drives too quickly or drives dangerously, or just they're not very good drivers. So we might choose not to get into that person's car because we associate bad driving with that gender or that race or that age group. Perhaps we think that that gender or that race or that age group speaks poor English or whatever language we speak. And therefore we might think to ourselves, well, I don't want to be in an awkward conversation where I don't understand someone, so I won't take that person's taxi. Well, all of those decisions are based on our observation of the population that that person is in. But if we say, well, I'm not going to get into that person's taxi, I'll take another taxi, on that basis, then we're discriminating. And we are denying that person the right to the money we're going to pay for our journey home. We're denying that person the right to a living, purely on the basis that they belong to a certain population. We don't know these people, we don't know anything about them, we haven't met them or spoken to them, but purely because we notice that they are of a certain gender, or that they are of a certain race, or that they are of a certain age group, for example, we deny them the right to earn a living from our ride home. That's a problem. That's discrimination. And in certain parts of the world, in certain parts of the law, discrimination is illegal, which is a good thing because discrimination is certainly bad. So that's one danger, that we deny civil rights, human rights to normal people. That's not a good thing. The other problem, though, is that we can cause a lot of trouble for ourselves. I am a television presenter, and as I think you heard a few moments ago, I also coach business people to present in their environment. So that might be in a boardroom in front of a PowerPoint deck with maybe 6, 8 or 10 people watching. Could be in a ballroom in front of 200 people, maybe at an industry conference. They might be on television. They might be a guest on Bloomberg or CNBC or something. They might be conducting a webinar, something like this, or making an online presentation. I coach people in these scenarios. And when you present in the business world, if you don't speak with respect and with sensitivity, if you ignore political correctness, then you can get yourself in heaps of trouble. And I'll give you some examples of that. It's not just a question of getting yourself in trouble, where maybe your career becomes threatened. But when you're speaking in these situations, you're wearing the badge of the organization for which you work, their brand, very much on your shoulders. You're representing them. So if you speak out of turn in an offensive way, that can bring shame on the entire company and have a really dramatic negative effect on that organization. Let me just share my slides with you, and I can give you an example. I'm sure you're all aware of the organization known as Netflix, wonderful product, a relatively inexpensive way to get super video content on your TV at home, very popular. It's a brand that's about as well known as any other, I would say, in the developed world, and is certainly picking up a lot of traction in every country around the world. Well, this man is, or was, the foremost communications spokesman for Netflix. So if you think there was anybody in that organization who would be aware of the need for sensitive speech, it would be this man. He is, after all, their communications spokesman. His name's Jonathan Friedland, and he was in a meeting with other Netflix people, and they were trying to establish whether or not there were any words or phrases that perhaps shouldn't form part of the content that they provide for the likes of you and me. And they decided that maybe one word in particular should be up for consideration and discussion. And he used the word, let me go back to Jonathan Friedland, he used a term that is considered to be very offensive in the United States in particular. It's a derogatory term for Black people. And I'm not going to say it out loud, but the phrase that's commonly used to refer to that word is the N word. Very offensive and really can get a lot of people into trouble. And he offered this word as a word that perhaps should be censored in some way, bleeped out, or maybe that scene should be cut. It was up for discussion. But instead of using the phrase N-word, he used the unadulterated, uncensored word. And other people who were attending the meeting didn't like him using that uncensored form of the word. And it got out. He was reported to the CEO, and that man that I just showed you there, Reed Hastings, got word of it, and Jonathan Friedland was ultimately sacked. Reed Hastings is quite a smart man. I know people that have met him and worked with him. And he wrote an email that I know he realized would make its way into the public domain. And I think it's worth examining a part of that email. Pretty much the full thing is in the book as far as I recall. But this is what he had to say on the subject. He said, "There's some confusion as to whether or not there is ever a time when the use of the N-word is acceptable. For non-Black people, the word should not be spoken, as there is almost no context in which it is appropriate or constructive, even when singing a song or reading a script. There is not a way to neutralize the emotion and history behind the word in any context." The use of the phrase N-word was created as a euphemism, and the norm, with the intention of providing an acceptable replacement and moving people away from using the specific word. When a person violates that norm, he added, it creates resentment, intense frustration, and great offence for many. So it was with that email that Reed Hastings justified, ultimately, the sacking of his foremost communications person. So a little bit of loose language, a little bit of careless thought about words that should be used, meant that this man lost his job, and it was a very prominent job in a very prominent company. I don't know what's happened to him career-wise after that, but I would imagine he finds it quite difficult to get more work. It's quite possible that that weak moment cost him his entire career. But it's not just a career that's been at stake. I wonder how many of you are familiar with this brand. I think I've seen it in Singapore. I think I've seen it near Queensway Shopping Centre. It's certainly prominent in the Philippines, and it's a big US brand. Obviously, it's a pizza brand, and there are Papa John's pizza stalls all over the United States, and they're very visible in sports stadiums, in Major League Baseball parks or NFL stadia, NBA arenas as well. Now, the founder and the CEO of Papa John's Pizza is that man in the picture. His name is John Schnatter. Now, as an aside, a couple of years ago, you might be familiar with the man kneeling on the right there, and his name is Colin Kaepernick. And he made the decision to protest police brutality of Black people by taking a knee, as you can see in the picture, during the national anthem before NFL games. And this became a very controversial, incendiary point. It was a big discussion point throughout North America and beyond, actually. President Trump certainly disagreed with the idea of taking a knee during the national anthem. He saw it as insensitive towards the nation, disrespectful towards the nation. But Kaepernick was joined by many, many athletes, both white and Black, throughout the NFL in taking a knee during the national anthem before NFL games. And those of you who are English Premier League fans will have noticed over the last few months that immediately before kickoff, all of the players also take a knee. And this was as a direct response to what Colin started doing a few years ago. But at the time, because it was very, very controversial and it involved dialogue with the president, and there was all sorts of people not really sure whether to take a knee during the national anthem or perhaps at another time, or whether they should be taking a knee at all. There was a big discussion, big debate about it. At the time, for Schnatter, who was the CEO and founder, you might recall, of Papa John's Pizza, he said that these protests that were happening, people were boycotting NFL games if they didn't believe in the idea of taking a knee, meant that fewer people were going to the stadiums, and therefore fewer people were buying pizza. This was seen as a little bit tone deaf. Perhaps he wasn't seeing that there were bigger issues at stake than mere pizza sales. And the company took quite a bit of bad publicity as a result. So he agreed to sit in some classrooms about sensitivity of language and public relations generally, that was conducted by an organization called Laundry Service. And as he was having these sessions with the people from Laundry Service, Schnatter brushed off his NFL remarks and said, well, he cited the founder of KFC, Kentucky Fried Chicken, and he said, Colonel Sanders called blacks, but he didn't use that phrase N-words. He used the unadulterated, uncensored word that Jonathan Friedland used. Now, again, this was in a closed-door meeting, but people who were attending the meeting didn't like the fact that that word had been uttered. And they reported him externally, and it got out into the media, and as you can imagine, bad things happened. Papa John's Pizza rather tanked. The stock price took a real nosedive. It happened in mid-July. It went down 6% in one day. Since then, it has really gone down. It's probably recovered slightly, but it has lost a lot of lucrative deals with the NFL. Major League Baseball and the NBA. So here's an example of loose-lipped, insensitive speech that didn't just affect an individual's career, but took down the entire company. I think not quite to the point where they were dissolved, they're still up and running. But I guess you must ask yourself, will a black person or anybody who is sensitive to the idea of hate speech from a racial point of view, will everybody ever walk past a Papa John's pizza restaurant and be able to not think about what that guy said? It's a bit of a stain on the profile of the organization. And it's hard to see how the stock or the brand and the goodwill that's always associated with brands will ever recover. So we need to think sometimes about what the areas are. You know, if I'm to be sensitive about speech, if I'm to make sure that I don't offend anybody, ruin my career, and bring down my company with me, what are the areas that I ought to be careful of? Well, race is something that we've discussed already. I think this is probably the most obvious area. Speaking about people in terms of their race, if you can avoid it, then just don't do it. Sometimes we do need to discuss race, and the book goes into some detail about how we need to not segregate, but how we need to split people up sometimes into their races. I mean, on your IC, it asks for your race, and for good reason quite often. Some medical treatment is more effective or less effective with different races. So it's important to know what race you are when this treatment is offered. In housing board flats, I think there is a policy to make sure that not too many members of a particular race are in one particular housing board flat, or one particular housing board building, that is. They want integration. They want there to be a sort of an even or at least proportionate spread, and that seems to be a very sound policy. So identifying people by race does have some uses, but when you do it, when you have to do it, speak sensitively about it. Make sure you use the right terms. Along with race, nationality is becoming increasingly pertinent. In the UK, when I was growing up, we used to tell jokes that were called Irish jokes. People from Ireland were the butt of the jokes. They were made out to be dim-witted, and that was the whole purpose of the joke. A similar trait was going on in the United States, but the butt of the joke then was people from Poland for some reason. I'm not quite sure what the derivation of all that was. But Polish jokes, Irish jokes that perhaps existed and were very popular in the 70s and 80s, some time ago, before many of you were born, I'm sure, really don't wash these days. You hear fewer and fewer of them, and that's a good thing, because obviously if you're from Ireland or you're from Poland and you're given this bad publicity in the form of, albeit a joke that's only designed to make people laugh, it puts you in a position where people view you in a different way, and that may have some impact on your economic viability or any other aspect of your way of life. Gender, sexism, misogyny is something I'm sure many of us are very familiar with, very aware of. And there are well-established laws in most developed countries that create equal opportunities, not only for races, but also for the different genders. And that's a good thing. It's a good sign of a progressive, developed country. Sexuality is different from gender. So we're talking about heterosexuality, homosexuality, bisexuality, and all sorts of fluidity in between. Of course, gender, by the way, isn't binary. The more you read about this, the more you realize that it's about more than just being either a man or a woman. I think my book mentions that Facebook classifies gender into, I think it was 73 different categories. So good to be sensitive to that. It may strike you as not something you're familiar with, aware of, or that you're very used to, but for some people, this is a very key issue. It's the very core of their existence. And if we're to be respectful, then we need to be aware of this. If we're not aware of these things, then we'll just go blazing through like a bull in a china shop and offend people without even realizing that we are offending them. Physical appearance. if you're overweight, underweight, tall, short, you have red hair, black hair, green hair, as my daughter once did for about 6 months. This is not something that increasingly we ought to make mention of. And we certainly ought not to hire and fire people on the basis of their appearance. It hasn't yet got quite as much traction as race, gender, and in some parts of the world, sexual equality. But physical appearance will become more and more pertinent as time goes on. And when you speak about people, be very careful about whether you need to discuss their appearance, and if you do, how you go about doing it. Disability, you would think, is an obvious one. We shouldn't really be speaking disrespectfully about people who are less abled. But if you think about our speech, sometimes we criticize people and we tag on descriptions or we call them names that relate to people's disabilities. And that's really not a nice way to reference people who are otherwise able. Mental health is a very big emerging topic. It's more pertinent for today's younger generation than it was for mine. And people are more aware of it and greatly more better educated on it. And that's a good thing. We shouldn't speak in a disparaging, dismissive, disrespectful way about people who may be struggling with mental health issues. And too often, descriptors and terms that talk about mental ill health enter into our speech. And we must be careful not to include these terms when we speak offhand, and certainly when we speak in the public domain. Religion, of course, is very, very key. And there's a high level of religious tolerance in Singapore. And this is often where we must be challenged, because on the left-hand side of the screen, we've got issues about non-binary gender and different forms of sexuality. But some religions are not open to different forms of sexuality. So we must be careful not to offend religious people and people who may be homosexual or bisexual. Now, you may have your own views on it. Very likely you will have a view on it, one way or the other. You either will or will not be religious. You either will or will not support the LGBT movement. But in some ways, you can't be both. And so speaking to a big audience, one needs to be aware of how the potential that there might be to offend one party or another if you speak without thought. Ageism was something I touched on when we had that analogy of leaving a party and getting into a taxi with different types of taxi drivers. So how do you go about this minefield? I mean, how do you navigate it? I think there are many takeaways, and probably the biggest thing is just to keep yourself educated about the terms that are appropriate and the terms that are fashionable and acceptable to use at the time of your speech, because these things change quickly. And I think now we all have a responsibility to keep up to date with how these things are changing. Perhaps this little walkthrough will help as well. Ask yourself when you're speaking publicly, do I need to reference a specific population? And if you really don't need to, then just don't do it. It'll save you a lot of trouble. Things ultimately will be very much easy for you. If you absolutely do need to reference specific subpopulations, then be aware that those acceptable references that I just spoke about will change over time. And it's your responsibility to keep up with what is and is not an acceptable term. And then once you do that, be careful not to stereotype, because, just to recap what we said at the beginning, observing a trait within a population can very easily lead to stereotyping, which in itself can and does very easily lead to prejudice and discrimination. And that's very unsatisfactory for anybody who's discriminated against. I'm sure perhaps everybody in the audience in one way or another has felt prejudiced either by their race or their gender or their age or their physical appearance or their ability or their disability. I'm sure we've all felt it, and I'm sure none of us particularly enjoyed it. So this is something that we ought to try and put into the world from our own energy, and hopefully we'll get something strong back from it as well. So let me stop sharing my slides and come back to you all now. That's my presentation. The book goes through chapter by chapter. It deals with the various areas and explains why each area is sensitive and perhaps how we should view each area. It'll deal with race, it'll deal with gender. I'm just looking for the table of contents. I'm sure I had one. Here we go. Religion, race, gender, sexuality, education, how we speak in the media and how we should consider what the media says as being right or wrong, and what the future might hold for these things. It's an ever-changing thing. This will never be something that can support you forever, but at least it will help you think in the right way. And as times change, then that will assist you in maneuvering these changing times so that you can speak with respect and try not to hurt people, and therefore not expose your career or your company, the organization for which you work, to a disastrous future. I hope you picked something up from that. I think we may have the opportunity for some questions. Pamela is with us, and Pamela, if there are any questions that have been posed, I'd be very happy to answer them. Oh, so Locker Room Talk is the title. The subtitle is A Guide to Political Correctness in the Public Domain. Locker Room Talk it was actually the idea of a Marshall Cavendish publisher. I was talking about how Donald Trump, who may or may not be re-elected as president in the next few hours, had said something particularly offensive about women. It was something that he said in his past, but it had come into the public domain because somebody had mentioned it to the press. And at first, it seemed to be one of the very early mistakes that he'd made. You know, all of these errors that he makes when he speaks is just like water off a duck's back. He seems to be indestructible. If Barack Obama or a former president had said just one thing that Donald Trump said, perhaps their presidency would have been over, but Trump just seems to wade through these things and not be affected by them. But it was the first big crisis that I think he'd had in terms of public relations. And he cast it all aside and said, yes, I said it, but this is just locker room talk, he said. Things that guys say to each other in the locker room. And in many ways, to give him full credit, it was a very succinct, very clever statement to make. Because who among us could hear that statement and then not think to themselves, well, yeah, I guess I've said something in private or in the company of friends that I wouldn't like to be put out there in the public domain. Let he who is without sin cast the first stone, that sort of scenario. And I think, therefore, when he said that nice, succinct phrase, it was just locker room talk, I think an awful lot of people, perhaps everybody, thought to themselves, yeah, I've been in that situation. I guess I can forgive him. It was a very smart phrase to use. And I was discussing it with a Marshall Cavendish publisher when I first pitched the idea of the book to them. And yeah, I must give Marshall Cavendish credit. They were the ones that said, well, why don't you call the book Locker Room Talk? So I said, good idea. I think mental health is an emerging area that everybody needs to be more and more aware of. First of all, we just need to be aware that it is a thing. When I look back on my cohort, the people that in my classroom, there were 30 people in my class. And I look at and they were all boys. I went to a boys' school, and I look at them and I wonder now, was that person like that because he had that condition, or he had these problems at home, or he was particularly stressed, or he suffered from anxiety, or he had some other mental health issue that weren't really defined for us in the 1980s when I went to school. We just sort of plowed through it, and we took the mickey out of people. We made fun of people if they showed some kind of a weakness. Thankfully, among our millennials, we have a generation that has great empathy and seems to have an extraordinary level of understanding for the people around them, which I would say is unprecedented. I don't know that there's a generation that has felt this way before. And I think it's very important for people of my generation, and perhaps a little bit younger. I would say, I was talking to my children about this earlier today. They think perhaps anybody who's 30 and above can learn an awful lot from anybody who's 30 years old and younger, because that's the generation that seems to have this remarkable empathy and understanding for people and the problems that they have. And I think things that describe, that casually, really off the cuff phrases that reference mental health have for too long been a part of our language and our everyday conversation. To say that somebody is bonkers or mad or crazy or, these things. I'm not saying that we should eliminate all of these terms from our vocabulary, not just yet, but I think before long, we'll become more and more sensitive to it. This is an emerging area because there are people that have difficulty grasping reality and dealing with the reality of what's going on around them. And these are serious problems that sometimes end in fatality, which is a tragedy, a real tragedy. Imagine losing your child to a mental health issue. So to speak with such disregard for these cases, now that we know more about them, now that we're better educated, now that more people around us have this empathy and understanding of the situation, I think is a little bit crass and something that I think we all, as reasonable people, can work hard to avoid. Care with our language. I always say language is important in every regard, but in this particular regard, it has its own special importance. We must take care of the words we use because there are a lot of people who can be very troubled by the loose and slack phrasing that we employ sometimes, Pamela. I think everybody needs to worry about it, or at least should give thought to it. Let's not say worry about it too much, but certainly we need to give significant thought to it. I think it's a bit too simple to say anyone over 30 needs to give it some serious study and anyone under 30 need not worry about it. My youngest daughter, I think, was very smart when I had this brief conversation with them earlier in the evening. She said that there's sometimes an oversensitivity. I think we're all probably aware of this idea that there's a phrase that goes something along the lines of political correctness gone mad. And sometimes political correctness and the concept of it can be very stifling. And I think we all, at every age, need to critically examine whether or not we're going too far with some things. We can still live our lives with some robustness. We can't afford to be sensitive, ultra sensitive about every mildly weak aspect of our makeup. We can't be bruised and too easily injured by everything. I think robustness is a key thing. It's a good quality to have. But yes, I think people of all ages, and particularly, the senior generation, if they want to coexist very happily with the younger generation, probably ought to do just a little bit of work in educating themselves about how this is evolving and how best to serve themselves when they speak not only to each other, but to people of different generations, because it's becoming more and more pertinent every year. It's certainly developing at a rapid pace in the Western world. There's a little bit of catch up going on here in Asia, but it won't be long before people are just as sensitive here as they are, let's say, in the United States. And I think we'll be well placed to get ready for that time in the here and now. It's a harsh world, isn't it? I think people need to understand that, things have changed very quickly. If things had changed more gradually, then I think we could all have sort of accommodated that change and got used to it. But people of all ages, not just young people of all ages are exposed to the idea of perhaps writing something or saying something that then gets put online and then is there to kick us in the teeth afterwards because it was ill thought, ill planned, and said with a lack of sensitivity. There was a time that the only people who wrote for publication were those people who had been through the mill, that had spent many hours writing and honing their craft to a point where a publisher would accept their manuscript for publication. There was a time where anybody who could take on the role of a presenter or somebody who could speak to a camera only got in that position because they'd got a job from a big media house like ESPN or the BBC or CNN. And they demonstrated consistently that they were able to broadcast and speak off the top of their head in an eloquent way that didn't expose themselves or their organization. Those people that became writers and became broadcasters were highly skilled in that environment. They were well suited to it. These days, whatever your job, whatever role you have, even if you're at school and you haven't even entered the job market yet, there's a lot of pressure on you, both official pressure from the education system and the career world, and also peer pressure to put yourself online, to write for publication, to write for potentially millions of people to read, to broadcast for potentially millions of people to watch and listen to you. And we're not all seasoned writers and seasoned presenters, which means we are greatly exposed. We may well say things that are all thought out and could end up resulting in quite a bit of trouble for us. There are numerous examples I could quote to you. Many of them are in the book. Err on the side of caution. Think very carefully about what you write. If you have an urge to write something about which you're passionate, particularly if it means you're a little bit angry at something, sleep on it. See if you feel the need to publish it or speak about it the next day. Give yourself some time to cool off and phrase things in the most sensitive way that you possibly can. Because there's no particularly good news here, Pamela. I think we're all very exposed at a very open level to getting ourselves into trouble in this line, in this world where, you know, online broadcasting and online publication is so prevalent. It's a difficult area. That's one of the reasons I wrote the book.